wonder if I should do a review of the new slider.
Sure, why not?
Hello everyone, this is John Meyer, and today we're going to be talking about the GVM 80QD slider. Now the whole intro sequence that you just saw was shot on the GVM slider except for a few shots that had the slider in them. So I've had this slider for a couple months, and today I'm going to show you how I use it to make my filmmaking workflow more efficient and get shots that I otherwise couldn't get. Now I've experimented quite a bit with sliders. I started out with a manual slider, then built a couple of DIY time-lapse sliders, but none of them were really dependable filmmaking tools, and so what I really wanted was something that was reliable, I could depend that it would work, easy to set up. So I eventually just decided to bite the bullet and get a commercially available motorized slider. Now I didn't really want to drop over $1,000 on a Rhino or something like that, so I started looking at some other brands, and as I was researching these brands, I couldn't really find any reviews from actual filmmakers who had used it on real-world shoots and knew how they operated, how reliable they were, and were willing to share their experience. So when I got the slider, I decided to create the review that I had been looking for. Now this review is not sponsored by GVM, they did not send me the slider, nothing against that, but just throwing that out there. So this is a 30-inch motorized slider. GVM also makes a longer version, but for me I think that 30 inches is kind of a sweet spot between length and portability. And the rails are made out of carbon fiber, most of the rest is made out of aluminum. It's all in all, I would say, a pretty good sturdy construction. It costs right around $310 from B&H. I actually got it on sale for $240 in a deal zone. I've seen several of those, so if you wait around you can get an even better deal on it. Now it runs off of Sony NPF batteries, which is really practical because most of us filmmakers have lots of these NPF batteries to power everything from LEDs to monitors. There's also a DC in port, which is really practical if you want to have it running in the studio all day. So I mainly bought this slider for specific use cases. For most of my filming I actually use a gimbal, the Ronin S, to get a lot of my B-roll, most of my B-roll, and some A-roll shots where you're doing walk and talk or where I just want to, add some motion without setting anything up. But for some things, a gimbal just can't replace a slider. So I'm going to go through 3 different areas where I use this slider and how I use it in each one and how it performs for me. So one of the main reasons that I got this slider was to use it for interviews, A-roll, anything where you just want a self-running camera that will just give you some slow cinematic movement just to add a little bit of visual interest to the shot without being distracting. And it really works quite well for this. So one thing that's really important for this kind of use is the tracking system, where it can do parallax around your subject, keep your subject in frame as it slides back and forth between the ends of the track. And on a lot of sliders that I've seen, there's a dedicated motor for panning and tracking the subject, but on this one they just use a special rail, third rail in the middle that goes across the bottom with a really neat system that enables you to pan and track without a separate motor. And it actually works pretty well. It's not perfect, but I'm really pretty impressed with how well it works for that. So how I like to set this slider up to track a subject is I first, with the slider turned off, put the camera in the middle, get my framing all set up, frame it the way I want it to be in the final shot, and then I'll lock in my tripod head right there. Then I'll just take and manually move it down to the end of the slider here, and then I'll just unlock these little wheels on both ends and move it until my framing lines up with what it was in the original shot on the ends. And then I'll go ahead and turn the slider on and set my end point. And I like to manually put it to the end of the slider before I turn the slider on. That way I don't have to waste as much time for the slider motor to move it all the way to the end. And then once I have it down to the end, I'll go ahead and turn the slider on and set up my endpoints. Now one thing to keep in mind is this slider loses your endpoints when you turn it off. So every time you use the slider you have to manually set your endpoints again, which isn't a big deal, but it can take some time. So then when I'm ready to set my endpoints, I just go into the menu here and go down to settings and then go set start. And you have to move it just a little bit if it's already where you want it, and then you just long press that button. And then long press the button again to go back to the settings menu, and then you just go set end, and then you just move it down to the other end of the slider and wait while it goes there. And when it gets to the end of the slider, you just stop it right there, and then you again long press, and then long press the middle button again to go back to the menu. And then just set it up as a continuous loop, and it will just keep going until the battery dies, which it actually has really good battery life. For time lapses, it will last, I would say, around 6 or 7 hours. It will last quite a while. So you could be running easily several interviews and, never have to change a battery. Of course, it's not hard to get extra NPF, so battery life really shouldn't be an issue. Now, the real question here is how smooth is the motion? So we're going to show you a couple speeds here. Here's what it looks like on the slowest speed tracking. Here's what it looks like on medium speed and on fast speed. So all in all, I'm pretty happy with the smoothness of this slider. It really looks pretty good. The panning motion as it tracks, it really looks nice and smooth. Now the first slider I got actually wasn't as smooth. I sent that one back to GVM for another reason. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the replacement they sent me has really been nice and smooth. So if you do end up with one that isn't smooth, just send it back to your retailer or GVM and hopefully you can get one that's better. So one thing to note is that it doesn't exactly start panning immediately when you reach the end of the sliding motion and reverse. It just has a little lag between the time the slider reverses and when it starts panning. Now, for me, this isn't really a big problem because I am going to be using the end of the sliding motion. It doesn't ramp down to the end extremely smoothly. It doesn't just suddenly stop, but it's not a super smooth ramp. And in general, I just wouldn't use the end of the sliding motion where it reverses. So for me personally, it's not a problem, but it's something to keep in mind. Now I did come up with a little hack where I wrapped a rubber band around the mechanism that pans on the bottom and over to the side where the belt attaches. And that has actually reduced the amount of lag that it has, but it's still there just a little bit. But it's to the point where I really don't even notice it. So overall, I'm really happy with the performance of the smoothness of this slider for the price especially. It's probably not quite as smooth as a Rhino, but it's definitely smooth enough for my purposes. And considering the price, it's very good. Now I usually just put this slider on one tripod, and as it moves to the ends, the slider can bend a little bit and the horizon won't be perfectly level the same as it was in the middle or at the other end. I think for me some of that comes from my tripod, but I think some of it also comes from the slider. I've seen other reviewers talk about that. And you can put it on two tripods. I have done that, but a lot of the time for me it's just too much to set up. It takes too long. So a lot of times I'll just put it on one tripod. For interviews and things, I like to use it as a close-up camera. It's generally not a huge issue because you usually won't notice the horizon drift too much in a short clip. But it is something to keep in mind, and I think if you were shooting a wider shot or a main interview shot, you might want to look at putting it on two tripods or a tripod in the middle and one on the end. And that will essentially get rid of any horizon drift. Now one thing to watch out when putting it on two tripods is that you don't let it slip off the tripod on the one end. I did this accidentally when I was setting up a two tripod setup. I had the Manfrotto 502 head on it but no camera, and one end slipped off of a tripod while I was setting it up while the other end was still on the tripod, and it actually ripped out the 1/4 inch 20 threads on the one end of the slider that was still on the tripod. So that's something to watch out for. I contacted GVM. They were really great to work with. They sent me a new slider, and as I mentioned before, it's actually worked better than the original. So it's just something to watch out for. Be kind of careful with those threads. I can't say that wouldn't have happened on another slider, but if you're careful with it, I don't think you should have any problem. I've never had a problem with the central threads. Just don't drop one end off of a slider. But I will say GVM's customer service was excellent to work with. They quickly sent me a slider and just all in all were really great to work with. So I have to say, in customer service, 5-star company. Now all in all, I have to say that the build quality is really good. I don't think I've seen any other parts of the slider that I would feel like might break or anything. So I would say all in all, it's really good. It could have happened to another slider. I haven't tested all the sliders out there for that. So something that a lot of people worry about with these motorized sliders is the noise that they produce for something like interviews. So I decided to do a test here to test out how much of a problem that is. Now right now I have the slider looping at 100% speed about 6 feet away from me, just over 6 feet, and I have on me the RodeLink lav mic taped under my shirt here, and that's what I've been getting all the audio for this from, and so that's a similar setup to what I would use for interviews or A-roll, something like that. So here's what it sounds like without me talking from 6 feet away with the gain levels where they normally would be for me talking. Now the same distance and the same mic with the levels boosted. So now I have it set up a little bit closer, about 3 feet away. So here it is again with mic levels where they normally would be for me talking. So now we'll do the same thing again about 3 feet away, except this time with the mic levels boosted. So this slider definitely fits the bill for me for interviews and things like that. It's fairly quick and easy to set up, and it does a great job. It's definitely smooth enough, and I've really enjoyed using it on a couple of shoots. Now the next thing that I'm going to talk about that I use this slider for is macro videography. Now sometimes you just want to add some movement to extreme close-up shots, where really you can't do that with a gimbal because you just have too much shake in your hands or in your arms. And this could also apply to product shots. Now a while back I actually shot a video that had a huge amount of super macro shots of bugs and stuff. Put a link in the description or somewhere to that. But it was quite a challenge. I was at that time using a manual slider with a tripod head, and it was pretty tricky to do. And I've done some shots with this slider, super macro, and it makes it a lot easier. Now I usually set it up on a shorter portion of the track, even set the endpoint shorter, because I usually don't need a very long movement. And I'll usually turn the speed down nice and slow, maybe between 10 and 40%. It just depends on what the magnification I'm using is. With a really high magnification, I might put it down at 10%, which is really pretty slow, or if it's a pretty wide macro shot, I might put it up to 40%. It just depends. And also, again, a lot of times I'll do a lot of different types of movement with the slider, but with parallax shots, you can actually get a pretty tight parallax by just putting the panning rod all the way to the maximum. It'll give you a pretty nice tight parallax that you can use for some pretty close-up macro shots. So something I thought I'd throw in here while we're talking about slider speeds is how long it takes to go across the whole track at different speeds. So I'll just put some of those numbers up on the screen. What it takes to go at the minimum speed, or 10%, 25%, 50%, 100%. So if we're doing super high magnification macro shooting, this slider actually isn't perfectly smooth. I'm not sure if that just has to do with the tolerance of the construction, or I think it might even have to do with the number of steps in the stepper motor, and it's really quite understandable at that high magnification. Now I haven't really used any other motorized sliders at that type of magnification to see how they would perform, but I can imagine that they wouldn't be perfectly smooth either. Now I found that it's generally pretty easy to just stabilize this out with a post stabilizer like the perspective stabilizer in DaVinci Resolve, or warp stabilizer, or whatever's in your software. So would I get this slider if I was only interested in super macro video? I don't think so, because it has a much longer range than you need, and there's probably better options out there for it. However, for things like product photography, I think this would be a great slider, and if macro is one of your interests and it's not the sole reason for getting this slider, I would say it works very well as long as you understand its limitations. Our last and final category is time lapses. Now this is probably the second biggest reason I got this camera. I love shooting time lapses, and it's really nice to be able to just add some slow movement to those time lapses. You can do hyperlapses with a gimbal, but sometimes you don't want such a crazy fast movement to it, just a slow movement. And so this slider does really well for that. It has a really nice system where it will trigger the camera automatically, and it can also do shoot, move, shoot time lapses. So like for things like the Milky Way, where you want to use long exposures, it will only move in between the exposures so that you don't get motion blur during your exposure. So you can set that all up in the menu in the controller, how long the interval should be, how long it should wait between the time it moves and the time it triggers the camera, all those kind of things. Anyway, all in all, it's a really nice movement and triggering system. And I've also had good results just setting it up with internal time-lapse mode on my camera, where the camera does everything except for moving the slider, and just set up the slider to the correct interval to match the camera. It really works pretty well that way. I've been happy with it, using it both that way and to trigger the camera manually for stuff like raw time lapses where I want to have the actual photo files to process manually. So the options in the time-lapse menu can be a little bit tricky to figure out, so I thought I'd go over how they work and how I use them. So first of all, I like to set my start and end points just because I don't want it to run into the slider while I'm not right there looking at it. And then I go here into the time-lapse menu, and then the first option that we have here is interval. Now you would think this is how long the camera sits there between when it moves, but actually that's not what it is. It's each time the motor moves how long it will run for. So this is in seconds. I keep it set at 0.1 seconds. You can set it all the way up past 60 seconds, but I just keep it set at 0.1 second and then control how far the camera moves by the speed that I set. So the next option is time lapse. This is how long it takes from when the slider moves to when it triggers the camera. For most time lapses, I'll just keep this set on 0.1. If I have a longer exposure time lapse, I'll move this up to maybe half a second or something, just so that the slider isn't still shaking when the long exposure is started. So then if you go down here, the next one is stop time, and this is what I would call the interval. So this is how long it is going to be from one camera trigger to another, except the interval that the camera moves is in addition to this stop time. So if you want to have an interval of 30 seconds between triggers, you would set this at 29.9, and so then your 0.1 interval of how long the slider is moving will add to that to be 30 seconds. Now, it really probably doesn't make a big difference, a 0.1 second addition to your time interval, but if you're trying to get exact to, let's say, match an internal camera timer, you might want to be aware of that. So I usually set this anywhere from 5 seconds or 3 seconds all the way up to 30 seconds plus for night lapses. It just depends on the time lapse. You could have a whole video on how to choose your interval for time lapses, but that's not really what this is about. So the next option is the number of photos. This is just the number of photos it will take before it stops taking. So the next option here is photo, and this is just the number of photos that the slider will trigger the camera to take before it quits. So I usually just set it higher than the number of photos I'm going to do, because I'm usually either going to come back when I'm ready to stop the time lapse or just go until the battery dies, like let's say for a night lapse or something like that. So photo, I just usually leave that a few thousand, because I usually don't do more than 1,000 photos in a time lapse. Occasionally I will, but not very often, because it creates a very long time lapse that usually when I'm editing, I just have a very short duration of a time lapse. Now the last option in this menu here is auto loop, and you can either set it to yes or no. It just depends if you're wanting it to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. I usually keep it to on just in case it reaches one end of the slider and I don't want to miss some action if I don't come back to stop it in time. So I'd rather have it keep looping than just stop, although I probably wouldn't use a continuous time lapse that goes to one end of the slider and then reverses, although I might, depending on how the motion looks. So when you have all your settings dialed in here, you just hit the middle button in the controller pad, and that will take you to the next menu where you can actually start your time lapse. So the first option that we have in this menu is speed. And this is controlled with the up and down keys, and it essentially determines the number of photos that you can take as it goes across the slider, because it determines how far the slider moves between each photo. So here on the screen you can see a table of several different speeds and how many photos the slider will take traveling once across its length. And I'll also have this down in the description as a file that you can download. Now I usually keep this set around 80% because that will take around 300 photos, and for me that's a fairly good length of a time lapse, around 10 seconds, 30 frames a second. I usually don't need time lapses that are much longer than 10 seconds because that's just usually longer than the space that I need to edit it into, and much shorter than that you can run into problems not having enough beginning and end to work with in editing and trim to just the part that you like. And then the next menu item here is direction. You can set this with the left and right keys and it will move in that direction. And so then underneath it will show you the number of photos that it's taken, and that adds up as it triggers the camera for each photo. Now, one other thing that I should mention as far as time-lapse is that it comes with a whole bunch of cables. It comes with an extension cable and then a whole bunch of connector cables to the camera. About 6 of them for everything, I think, from a GoPro to 2 different ones for Canon, I think Nikon, just a whole bunch of different brands. You can trigger just about any camera that you have with this, so that is really nice to have all those cables. And I've actually even used the slider remote on its own as an intervalometer just to trigger the camera for time lapses off the slider. So that's another use that you can use this slider for as well. So as far as mounting this slider for time-lapse, I usually either just put it on a single tripod or I just set it on the ground resting on its little feet. The feet are pretty short, so I wouldn't use it in anything that's very uneven or tall and you have to screw them in and out, so that's a little bit of a disadvantage, but they work fine on fairly flat surfaces, like let's say a rock, or I've also used it with a tripod on one end and then just slanting down to the ground, and I found that that's also a pretty good setup. One thing that's nice to do with time lapses is either move vertically or diagonally on an angle, and this slider actually does that fairly well. Now vertically, the motor I don't think is quite strong enough to lift a very heavy rig. I think the heaviest I could get it to lift was my Canon SL1 with a 50mm 1.8 or maybe a 14mm f2.8 Rokinon. But going diagonally, I was able to easily use a Canon 7D with a Rokinon 14mm 2.8, which is a fairly heavy setup, plus a ball head with no problems, pulled that right up the 45-degree incline. I actually don't think that it's so much a motor strength problem as that the belt is slipping. But whatever the case, it won't pull up a very heavy rig vertically, so that's just something to watch out. You might be okay if you're using a pretty light camera, like maybe a Sony a6300, a6400 with a pretty light lens, but anything much heavier, I wouldn't try to use it vertically. Now at a 45-degree angle, I would say you should be able to do a 5D or, anything like that, unless it's a super heavy lens on there. So I would say diagonally it works pretty well. Vertically, you're probably going to run into problems. So this is also a nice use for the track and pan. You can either track your subject in the middle and get a nice parallax effect around it, or pan to get a wider landscape and get more of the scene in your shot. So I would say time-lapse is probably the only time I would really use the pan feature, because otherwise I can just pan with my tripod head or with my gimbal and not necessarily use a slider, but it is a nice movement that you can use with time-lapse. So all in all, I would say that it really works quite well for time lapses. I haven't used the other brands, but I think for time lapse it could compare quite well against a Rhino or edelkrone or Syrp Jenny or something like that. So I would say it's a pretty good rig for time lapse. So would I recommend this slider? If you're looking for a more affordable alternative to some of the major brands, I would say definitely yes. Now, is it 100% of what, let's say, a Rhino slider would be? Probably not. The menu system isn't quite as polished as a Rhino, and it's probably not quite as smooth, but it's only 1/3 the price, and I would say as long as you're aware of its limitations, it can totally be a reliable filmmaking tool and be a great addition to your kit. While this definitely won't replace my gimbals and other tools for creating camera movements, since it's just a different tool for a different job, it definitely has found a place in my kit, and I'll keep using it to supplement my other gear as a great way to add some hands-free camera movement and shoot incredible time lapses. So, that's it for my review. If you found it helpful, feel free to subscribe to my channel as I plan to create more content like this in the future. If you have any comments or questions about this slider or something that I didn't cover that you would like to know, feel free to leave a comment down below and I will make sure to get back to you. And until then, keep creating for good and for God.